So good morning. Welcome to the first session of the PACT workshop conference. We always keep confusing whether it's a workshop or a conference. It's great to see all the numbers here. I assume that a good number of you are the participants and paper presenters, discussants at this conference, and others have joined us in with various interests. So welcome and good morning. Welcome to the National Law School. We start this session with a brief introduction about the project. I will do a first cut and Rochna will follow, followed by an introduction to our first keynote speaker, Professor Pratap Mehta, and hand over to him for about 45 to 50 minutes, after which we'll open up for a conversation across the room. So the Pluralist Agreement on Constitutional Transformations project, the PACT project, is about 2 years old now, and we have been in a multi-university team based out of SOAS, Oxford, York, and the National Law School, been working on trying to develop a new understanding of the formation and process of agreement that made the Indian Constitution. The project has two parts. One part is to try and rethink and rework the archive of constitutional material that we take to be a useful corpus to understand the creation of the Indian Constitution. The second part of the project focuses on developing new theoretical models to understand the transformation. So for those of you who had a look at the workshop outline, you will see both parts. Some part is empirical, some part is more normative and theoretical. That's the structure that the project takes. Now, the project has many components. Once again, if you look at the schedule, you'd see various members of the project present on archives in India, a new search platform called Quill, and various other elements. I'm not going to try and summarize all of that this morning, except to say that this is the range of the project. And this workshop is an opportunity for us to deepen our understanding of what we might have achieved or not in the last 2 years, and invite what I think is an excellent group of scholars who are already engaged in this period of Indian constitutional history to share their work with us and take this conversation forward. So that's the nature of the project and the nature of the intervention of which this conference is a part. So let me invite Professor Rochna Bajpai, who is the lead PI on this project, to take us forward and probably provide a deeper theoretical take on what pluralist agreement might look like and what is the conceptual frame of the project that we're trying to explore here. Rochna.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here at this fantastic institution, which has produced much groundbreaking scholarship on the making of the Indian Constitution. My name is Rochna Bajpai. I'm principal investigator, as Sudhir mentioned, of PACT. There are many of us, many around the room, who contributed a great deal to the understanding of constitutions and constitutional history. PACT was envisaged as a research collaboration which would try to take forward the idea of constitutions as negotiated agreements between diverse groups of individuals. A key and often neglected aspect of the Indian Constitution is the fact that it was negotiated between very diverse groups of individuals who came to an agreement on a text. And in the divided world in which we live today, in which it's extremely hard to come to agreement on any topic, the fact that such a diverse group of individuals at one of the most critical and violent and conflict marked moment were able to reach an agreement is what is an achievement, however flawed the outcome of that agreement may be. So PACT is a project which seeks to agree to understand how this was arrived at, how this process of agreement was arrived at between these diverse groups of individuals. And there are two sets of stories that we seek to foreground in the work we do, which takes multiple forms. It's archival, it's digital, and it seeks to build, as Sudhir just put it, new theoretical models. Two stories. One, the stories of forgotten amendments of committees and the amendments that were tabled or not tabled formally, whether they made their way into the Constitution or not. And with the help of the Quill project in Oxford, we are both documenting and visualizing that process in a new digital platform. And the second is forgotten histories of those who may have made representations, petitions, mobilizations of various kinds in relation to the Constitution, which didn't make their way either on to the plenary debates or to the final Constitution, but which nevertheless engaged with Constitution making, as the pioneering work of historians has shown us in recent times. So these are the two neglected stories of Constitution making that we seek to foreground. And we seek to learn from the example of how pluralism and diversity, in the midst of pluralism and diversity, negotiations are conducted to reach outcomes which then last over time, the Indian Constitution being a key example of a constitution in the global south that is one of the longest lived for all its flaws, and that continues in the present to elicit participation from people around the country, in particular the marginalized. We seek to learn from this process, and we see it very much as a collaborative process. So PACT is a collaboration between the universities of SOAS, the National Law School, the University of York, the University of Oxford, and we seek to, through the engagements and the research that the project fosters, to learn from what the Indian example can teach us about how negotiated agreements are arrived at in these contexts, and what we can learn from this process in a context which is marked by growing autocratization, growing concentration of power in smaller and smaller hands, political and economic power around the world. I'll stop there and hand back to Sudhir.
Yeah, thanks, Roshna. And we start this conversation with an inaugural keynote from Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. I will do a brief introduction. I'm sure most of you in the room know him and know his work. But I'll walk you through an introduction and then suggest some reasons why we thought that engaging Pratap at this conversation might be useful before I hand over to him. So Pratap Bhanu Mehta is the Laurence S. Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. He was previously Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University and President of the Center for Policy Research at Delhi. He has previously taught at Harvard University, Ashoka University, and JNU, and has been global faculty at the NYU Law School. He's published widely in political theory, history of ideas, Indian constitutional law, and politics in India. He is the author of The Burden of Democracy, 2003, and has produced several edited volumes, including the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution. His forthcoming work looks at philosophical ideas about religion in 20th century India, and we look forward to reading more about that at this juncture in Indian political history. His policy experience includes being convener of the Prime Minister of India's Knowledge Commission between 2005 and 2007, and a member of India's National Security Advisory Board. He is also an editorial consultant to the Indian Express, and I suspect that many of us in this room have read and engaged with those columns over the last decade. In thinking about the conference and how we might like to present and engage with the ideas of this conference, we were keen to bridge the disciplines of political science, political theory, and law, in this case, constitutional law, as being the primary push, the primary vector behind this project. And we couldn't think of a better person who's done this over the last decade and a half than Pratap. We have had the opportunity at the National Law School to engage with Pratap, albeit in COVID times and virtually. So we're delighted that on this occasion, Pratap is here in person and readily agreed to be here and speak with us. He has engaged with generations of graduates of this university in various capacities, and we hope and are as excited to engage with the future generations, many of whom are in this room. Thank you, Pratap, for joining us, and over to you.
It's an incredible privilege to be here. The most intellectually intimidating people I meet in my life are always graduates from this institution, and they're also the most fun. So I approach this talk with both kind of trepidation and anticipation, but I'm really, really grateful to Professors Bajpai and Krishnaswamy and the entire organizing team for this opportunity. What I'll do in the next few minutes, and I don't want to cut into the next section, we started a bit late, so I might just kind of bridge things, just signal like 3 minutes before.
Yeah, we have a lot of buffer built in.
That I'm happy to, is reflect on two puzzles. And I'll be very personal about those puzzles. I think of myself as a constitutionalist, at least we all believe in constitutional values. I also think of myself as a pluralist, at least insofar as there is a worldview. My axiological commitment is to value pluralism. You can derive it from different traditions, but it is a kind of description of the nature and status of value. And yet I actually think these two things are in incredible tension with one another. So that's the kind of the one big provocation I want to kind of share with you, and a personal perplexity. The second provocation and perplexity I want to share with you is one of the remarkable things about this PACT project, and you can see it in this really astonishing group of scholars it is assembling today and tomorrow. I've learned so much from each one of them. That one of the most exciting things is that it is going to be doing a lot of work of historically excavating different forms of constitutional discourse, remind us in a sense of perhaps even the contingency, right, of the kind of constitutional outcomes we actually ended up with. So on the one hand, when we approach the study of constitutions, we actually approach that study historically, right? That is partly what it means to study the Constitution as an object, as it were, right? And yet the self-presentation and legitimation of constitutions is actually completely the opposite, right? So think of this political moment globally. We had an election in India, and in part, one of the slogans in the election was, save the Constitution. We'll debate what that means, but, right? Across the world, democracies, right? In Poland, the Constitution has been saved by a whisker, right? Now, at one level, there is this political moment in which we are all trying to save something. Right? what is this thing that we are trying to save? And why do we think this thing that we call the Constitution has that kind of atemporality about it, such that the thought of radically changing it, right, rather than fulfilling its promise, seems to fill us with immense dread, right? Now, there was a joke circulated many years ago. You remember Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, right? After the fall of the Cold War. It's a very complicated and subtle book, but broadly speaking, in a sense, the age of ideological contention is over. There are no real challenges to liberal democracy. And I remember somebody once joking that actually the end of history thesis was not invented by Francis Fukuyama. It was actually invented by jurists in different countries, including Indian jurists who propounded the basic structure doctrine, right? Because if you think about it, what all these different juridical doctrines, say of the Constitution, basic structure of the Constitution, right, attribute to the Constitution is a kind of atemporal authority, right? I suspect most people in this room, right, maybe there'd be interesting disagreements, would be committed to a version of constitutionalism of the following sort. A constitution entrenches some conception of individual rights, usually to protect the freedom and dignity of individuals. It affirms the political equality, at least of all citizens, and we can debate what political equality means. It provides institutional checks and balances on the concentration of power and the exercise of arbitrary power, right? It allows citizens to exercise political agency. That's the kind of democratic component, and also engages or brings about transformation through practices of political justification, right? This is, in a sense, the modern liberal constitutional package, right? And the remarkable thing about this package is that we are at a kind of moment in history, that's the end of history claim, that any claim must operate within the horizon of this package. We can debate, its meaning at the edges, right? We can ask what institutional conditions, what political conditions will secure this amalgam. Right? But there is actually no looking outside of the horizon, as it were, of this package, right? In a sense, this Constitution, basic structure, whichever way you want to put it, has this peculiar kind of atemporal authority over us, right? And that's what I mean by, in a sense, provocatively, the kind of end of history thesis. So on the one hand, we want to kind of keep excavating the contingent nature. Of course, it's a historical document. It emerged out of a particular history. But in the process, it now acquires this atemporal authority. You might say it actually performs roughly the same kind of discursive function as Sanatan Dharma does, right? If you think about it as a concept, right? This is our Sanatan Dharma. How dare you think about changing this constellation? If around the edges, we can do things. We can debate economic policy. We can debate taxation policy, some redistribution, some reservations. This amalgam, that's the end of history. And the remarkable paradox of the moment is that we bristle at the thought that we are at the end of history. And yet, our modes of talking, our discursive horizons, now increasingly our institutional imaginations are basically, in a sense, tied to this. So, Thomas Jefferson's worry, right, about constitutionalism, that it makes everybody who comes after that a mere footnote to history, right, is a kind of, and that's the paradox I think it's worth actually reflecting on. Because this is a very, very peculiar way of thinking about constitutions, right? And I want to kind of underscore this strangeness because this is a kind of historical project or a project of historical excavation. Think of other ways in which people have thought of constitutions historically. And one of the most remarkable things about the way people have thought of constitutions in other ways is that in those ways of thinking, history was, as it were, embedded in the Constitution. The Constitution was not this kind of atemporal authority that then exercised sovereignty or authority, in a sense, over future generations. So just to give three examples, right? Three very radically different ways of thinking about constitutionalism. And I'm going to be very crude about it, but we hope you can see the point heuristically, right? So one conception of a constitution is basically just the assemblage and totality of practices by which people live, right? This is kind of customary constitutions. If you take Indian texts like Niti Sar or something, and look, every tradition has constitutions. I mean, every tradition has a conception of what is arbitrary power. It makes all kinds of distinctions, allocates authority, right? But roughly speaking, it's a version of constitutionalism that basically says the life world as it is constituted, right, in its customary practices, just is that totality of assembly, just is how that society is constituted. And in fact, the measure of arbitrary power, right, is almost always in relation to that customary law. Now, the most sophisticated version of this arguably was England, that actually, I think the peculiarity of English constitution is not parliamentary sovereignty. It is actually that the assemblage of practices since the Norman yoke, that just is the Constitution of England, right? Had certain advantages. One, there's no gap in a sense between the Constitution and the life world, right? So no kind of motivation problem. It has a theory of historical change built into it. The Constitution changes as the assemblage of these practices change. And the attraction of this kind of common law, customary constitutionalism, I think as Hayek noticed, was the kind of the analogy with language, right? Just as language incrementally changes over time, it has a kind of conception of history baked into this customary evolution, right? That's one kind of conception of. There's a second conception of constitutionalism, which we don't pay as much attention to, which was the kind of 20th century party state version of constitutionalism, which also explicitly has a historical dimension built into it. The party is the vanguard, right? In a sense, the bridge between the present and the future. The non-negotiable point of that constitutionalism is the authority of the party in the party state. And that's non-negotiable. But what values will constitute that bridge between the present and the future? To use Maoist language, what are the principal contradictions to which now the Constitution must respond? That will actually change radically. I mean, you can go socialist, you can go, authoritarian, you can go, in a sense, that's what the party state in some senses does, right? But it has explicitly built into it, if you read kind of Chinese discussions on constitutionalism, the party state. This idea that actually what it means for the Constitution to have a history is for it to be this instrument, not just once, as we say in the Indian Constitution, 1947, the basic history ended. Now we are kind of, tinkering around the edges. It is to actually possibly even kind of radically revise it, so long as that instrument of revision, that party remains, right? So it has temporality built into it. But the third conception of constitutionalism, which was by far the most prevalent, and one which still has some hold on us, but we don't find to, in a sense, articulate it, which is, if you had asked anybody before the 19th century, actually probably even before the 1930s and 1940s, what does a constitution do, right? I gave you a list of what constitution does: limits on governmental power, individual rights, allocation of authority. The most salient answer you would have probably got is that the function of a constitution is to actually represent the nature of social power in the constitution itself, right? And constitutional change just is the change in the character of the social power that is represented in the constitution. Okay? Very famously, again, very simplistically, crudely, there's the feudal constitution. The nobility is kind of represented. The constitution represents the social power dynamics of society in the constitution. There's no actually disguising it. In fact, before the 20th century, everybody who thought about constitutions was actually a Marxist, because they actually said, look, that is what a constitution is. it represents the nature and social character of social power, right? What it does is it organizes that social power in a way in which the polity can act as some kind of, in a sense, unified agent. When you think of all the metaphors we use, mixed constitution, right? Checks and balances. In that conception of social power, checks and balances was not about the formal separation of powers. The checks and balances were you needed concrete social forces to be represented in the constitution for that check and balance to work, right? So you need the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy together. You need corporations. You can think of any constitution, German constitution of 1819, English constitution, right? That the function, and I think, I mean, Rohit and Odit might kind of correct me on this, but in some of the early discussions of kind of princely state constitutionalism, there are residues of that. That what the constitution does, in a sense, represent the nature of social power, right? Right? Under, of course, a kind of monarch or somebody, right? Now, notice in all of these three conceptions of constitutionalism, the constitution is actually just meant to change history, right? There is no sort of eternal Sanatan Dharma, as it were, that exercises this atemporal authority, right? I mean, this was very famously John Pocock's kind of Machiavellian critique of liberal constitutionalism, right? That it wasn't just that liberals did not understand, right? That political order is a function of a certain kind of politics, these snippets of order snatched against fortune, right? It is that the nature of constitutionalism will always be determined by either the flux of custom or the flux of social power, right? This was Harrington's critique of Hobbes, right? When he said, look, I'm going to teach you what you taught me, which is when I think of constitutions, I think of the distribution of social power embodied in it. That, in a sense, keeps that society going, right? So one of the interesting questions to ask, right, given how, on the one hand, we are so acutely historically conscious, right, and believe in historical contingency, how come this really bizarre, historically unusual conception of constitutionalism actually took hold? And why do we have so much invested in it in some sense? And I do want to kind of present this as a provocation that despite the fact that we live in an age of hyper-historical consciousness, right, at least liberal constitutionalism does seem to want to act out the kind of end of history thesis, right? Now, there's some obvious explanations for this. I won't go into this. One obvious one is, of course, under conditions of modernity, the logic of custom fades. Custom has to be replaced by consent and justification. No life world can be unproblematically taken for granted, right? So in that sense, there is no customary law that can have authority. There's the logic of formal political equality, because the logic of formal political equality requires the abolition of at least formal markers of social power, right? This was both the promise of liberal constitutionalism and, as Marxist critics point out, its greatest weakness, because they said what this abolition does is, in a sense, it simply disguises the fact that society is still constituted by different forms of social power. It just doesn't allow the constitution to represent them, right? So in some senses, liberal constitutionalism was to that older representative constitutionalism roughly what capitalism was to feudalism, a kind of disguise operation, right? The third thing, of course, is the rise of individual freedom as a value, because a constitution can represent social power only when two conditions are met. Groups are relatively fixed, right, in membership, and that group status is almost like a compulsory identity in some ways, right? You're a bourgeoisie, you're a feudal lord, or you can think of ethnic groups in a sense, right? The constitution of kind of ethnic representation is, in a sense, premised on there being this kind of close connection between group identity and a particular form of social power that requires representation. Right? The more identities, in some senses, get individualized, it's actually not clear how you can stably represent a structure of social power, or even more radically, any of those forms of social power that you now want to represent will also themselves have to be politically constituted through the process of public justification and democratic articulation. So there is no natural subject, whether in class terms, the bourgeoisie is not a natural class, the feudal lords are not a natural class, the working class is not a natural class, it has to be discursively constituted through the practices of democracy. And the same in principle is true of ethnic groups, at least ideally, right? Okay. Diversity can be arranged around so many axioms, right? Which is why, I mean, my colleague Greg Conti's fantastic book on 19th century England, where he charts this transition where till the 19th century, if you had asked what's a legitimate democracy or representative government, the answer would be a legitimate form of government or representative institution is one that simply mirrors the nature of social cleavages, right? So representation was organized. We need the working class, or we need working classes from this borough, or we need, enough for the bourgeoisie, or we need the intellectuals in place. Whichever way you divide society, your dominant institutions are in a sense mirrors of those social cleavages. But you cannot, in a sense, have a mirror reflecting those cleavages if those cleavages themselves aren't stable in some respects, right? They are, in a sense, constantly shifting. And that's the big shift in our understanding of democracy in the 19th century, right? That it actually moved from this idea that representative institutions, constitutional institutions are simply mirrors of different forms of social power. We can debate how to best organize them, to this more kind of anonymous, liberal, in some senses, kind of constitution, right? And so in that sense, right, there's kind of, you might say, kind of much deeper, and the mobility came about because of industrialization, modern commercial society, a whole range of other things. That very popular idea of constitutionalism, which I said was the core of constitutionalism till the 19th century, as the representation of social powers, simply vanished. Now, its traces remain in our political discourse, right? One, because at least in one sense, liberal constitutionalism does take on board one aspect of that idea, but in a negative way, that you cannot exclude certain kinds of people from representation in the system because of who they are. It's a kind of negative injunction, right? In some, so you might say, in that sense, a constitution constitutes social power. The Indian Constitution sought to reconstitute Indian social power through this negative injunction, right? You should not discriminate and so on and so forth, right? But in a sense, it's a negative injunction more than a kind of positive articulation of how that constitution, in a sense, might represent social power. But a lot of the tussle in our politics, when we are saying, saving the constitution, what are we trying to say? There are two versions of it. One is that bare liberal one that I kind of outlined, right? The conditions for the free exercise of public justification and democratic agency. There is another version, which actually says, look, the test of this constitution will be the way in which it fundamentally ends up facilitating the representation of fixed social power, right? And I think one of the interesting questions in our democracy is which of these two versions is in some senses at stake, right? And lastly, I'll end quickly with just a couple of remarks on pluralism, which is, as you famously know, and Sudhir has written so kind of wonderfully on this in this kind of basic structure book. So one of the challenges there for this modern conception of constitutionalism that, in a sense, I outlined is how does this form of constitutionalism, in a sense, engage with the problem of sovereignty, right? Conceptually, this constitution becomes the constitution of sovereignty. And for good Hobbesian reasons, shared sovereignty is an oxymoron. So the only constitutional morality you can have, technically, is the morality that is actually internal to the constitutional sovereignty. And as you know, very famously, most liberal theorists, following Rousseau's read, kind of nicely cheated on this. They cheated on this simply by saying, well, a people can be sovereign only if the people is properly constituted. What does it mean for a people to be properly constituted? Through a constitution or through conditions that secure the individual freedom and equality of each one of its members, right? And it is for this reason, I think, I just want to put this out there, that while we want to make the distinction between liberalism and democracy, often we do, right? In practice, the constitutive conditions of liberalism and the constitutive conditions of democracy turn out to overlap substantially. And it's not a historical accident that almost any attack on liberalism ends up, liberalism in this constitutional sense, will end up as an attack on democracy at some point and vice versa, right? So the idea of an illiberal democracy is a bit of an oxymoron. Yeah? Just one little kind of historical footage. So again, Ornit and Rohit might have actually come across better words on this. I was trying to look up the etymology of Samvidhan in at least Sanskrit and other Indian languages, right? Of course, it's a term that's freely used in the Mahabharata in very different contexts. Krishna is actually the creator of Samvidhan. I mean, he of course creates a Samvidhan through the order of time. The plan that he who wields the chakra makes, right? And that incredibly poetic references to this act of constituting. But when Raghuveer, was Professor Lokesh Chandra's father, one of the kind of great Sanskritists of the 20th century, he bats for using the word Samvidhan as a translation for the Constitution, right? And the gloss is actually quite interesting. So it just takes the literal gloss, which is some upsarg prefix meaning together. There's a debate about it, how you interpret it etymologically, but in a particular way, in a vishesh way. Vidha, a term from Mimamsa, right? So ordering in a particular way. And the gloss he gave was, in a sense, a constitution is a way, is in a sense, a way of together producing something and bringing into being something that is more like the Mimamsa ritual, right? It is the act of performing it that actually brings it into being, and the emphasis, in a sense, the act of performing it together, which in a sense is a kind of gloss to the argument in the sense I've been making, that in a way, what the modern constitution does, while it claims atemporal authority, that authority can subsist only if we, in a sense, together reenact it at every moment. Right? That's, in a sense, its concrete connection with politics. Now, I just want to close with one thought on pluralism. I know I'm running out of time. I must to say about pluralism. So why did I say that I have a worry about kind of constitutionalism and pluralism? One is this kind of tension between constitutional and Western. Now, if my version of the end of history constitutionalism is the description of where we are, right? This kind of package that I just outlined, then where does pluralism fit into this liberal constitutional scheme, right? Now, if you examine most of our constitutional disputes, ones other than the ones that arise from like administrative law or tort law, which, gets constitutionalized for a variety of reasons, those disputes, and I mean, really reductionist here, usually revolve around two questions. One is what you might call the boundary problem of this end of history constitution. So this is the constitution whose authority arrests time, whose normative values, in a sense, are the measure of how we can act. They provide the horizons within which we are constrained. But the enactment of that constitution, right, of course, is something we have to do in our daily lives. We have to act as if this constitution is eternal, right? But the question is then, who is the we here? right? Who is, in a sense, the demos in whose name this daily enactment of this kind of modern equivalent of the Mimamsa ritual of the Sanatana Dharma is in some sense enacted out, right? And of course, as we know, famously, liberalism and democracy both have had a problem with membership. Who gets to be included, right? What are the terms of, in a sense, this inclusion? And that's the debate in a sense around nationalism that we see in different contexts. The second debate, and that's one way in which pluralism gets implicated, right? But the second debate, perhaps more important for pluralism, is what is the scope of this constitution? So not in a sense just the membership question. What do I mean by scope? So for much of the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, one way in which liberal constitutionalism sold itself, justified itself, was to say, look, the beauty of this constitution, it leaves people to be free to be who they are and construct the kinds of lives, associations, economic choices that in some sense that they want to make, right? And I think there is something to that, in a sense, promise. So it's not a constitution that burdens people with identities matter to people, people's differing values matter to people. But the whole point is that the constitution should not bear the weight of those identities and those plural choices. Right? But underlying it was a sociological story that there are lots of domains which govern our lives, right? Through different kinds of associations, NGOs, corporations, families, religious organizations, you name it, right? A whole variety, right? Which provide a kind of institutional setting where we can enact out these plural views. So the constitution doesn't have to be religious, but your private religious organizations can be in some senses religious, do whatever you want, right? Okay. Now the challenge and why this constitutionalism in a sense has underbeen pressure, which is, do those forms of, let's call them non-state institutional life, some of it is private, but some of it is not private, does that form of non-state institutional life have to also work to secure the conditions of that formal liberal constitution, right? So as a formal liberal constitutionalism, high premium on individual freedom and equality, right? Now there's a sociological critique which says, look, unless the dominant institutions of society do not actually produce those practices in their association life, you're actually not going to be able to get those values in the life of your common citizenship, right? And which is why, in a whole range of things, right? We have sought to horizontally extend in a rationalist kind of way that liberal version to range of associational life. Right? The question is, in some sense, if that's the view, right, that in a sense what liberal constitutionalism is a rationalist project of then slowly reconstituting other spheres of life in the image of that constitution, then what is the kind of pluralism that is actually possible, right? Now, there will be a lot of pluralism, but it's a pluralism that is going to emerge not by taking pluralism as an objective, but a pluralism that simply emerges from the exercise of individual freedom and equal political rights, right? And the interesting thing is, if you take that view, then pluralism in a sense becomes a redundant constitutional category, right? The core idea is simply, to put it in the most obvious terms, give everybody equal freedoms compatible with like freedom for all, secure the conditions for the exercise of their political agency, and whatever freedom emerges. Just like the Constitution is not in the business of representing social power, because there is no such thing it can normatively acknowledge. It is also not in the business of representing pluralism, because pluralism by its very nature can't be represented, because it is an exercise of, in some sense, of that freedom. Right? And again, as I said, this is thinking aloud, this is provocation. We have this interesting point where we chafe at the thought of end of history, right? I mean, the one thing everybody's united on is kind of liberalism is not the end of history, can't be. This is too sort of bleak a future. Even in Fukuyama's thing, it was said almost elegiacally, look, this is the best we can come up with, right? And so it's kind of constantly delegitimized from all sides. And yet the only ground we are standing on, or the base we are standing on, is that end of history ground. And on the pluralism side, we end up misrepresenting the implications of liberal constitution for pluralism if we actually cast it as a project for protecting pluralism and giving it representation. It is actually a project for freedom, and the pluralism chips can fall wherever they will.
Thank you, Pratap. So, and let me perform my temporal duties, which is to keep time. We will take 20 minutes from here. We're at 10 o'clock, slightly off the schedule, but we have some buffers to catch up on. Please keep your questions short, identify yourselves, and speak into a mic. I don't know if there are handheld mics, if you can move them around. Yes, please, hands. Who would like to start? There's your hand. Rochna, please.
Between pluralism and freedom. To just take on the last, your concluding.
Yeah, so if, in the interest, I'll give a kind of a bit of a cop-out of an answer. So the cop-out answer would go something like this, which is, if you're a value pluralist, and one of the reasons value pluralism, even if it's true as an axiological, is actually not very helpful in thinking of constitutionalism, is the following. So there's one version of value pluralism, which is the kind of tragic version, right? Which is there are lots of values, things worth having. You can't realize all of them simultaneously in the same society. Some things got to give. The society is built on virtues of loyalty will not have the same characteristics as society built on freedom. I mean, you could run it kind of several different ways. Now, the problem that arises is, suppose you have two groups in something, both of whom are standing the ground of value. And that's for a moment grant that the values that seek to instantiate are in a sense objective, right? I mean, they are values, right? You would even in a sense acknowledge. But when you come into conflict over which one, the liberal answer is in that sense going to be, well, privilege the one that in a sense, makes the space for maximum individual freedom. Right? And that is strictly speaking not a kind of value pluralist answer. Because in a sense, a value pluralist answer would say that you actually can't lexically rank. Right? So this end of history liberal constitutionalism, in a sense, is actually premised on the priority of individual freedom. And only such pluralism that actually just emerges out of that in a sense exercise, right? And that's why I think in the end, pluralism becomes somewhat kind of irrelevant to thinking about at least liberal constitution, right? That's so. I think the second way in which which is perhaps more practical, is, so one of the logics, right, of pluralism is that pluralism in turn has to take recourse to the language of liberal constitutionalism in the following way. So I see group A seeks to impose its values on group B, and let's say they're valuable, even group B acknowledges they're valuable. It just so happens they don't want to live that way, right? Part of the argument in resisting that is the argument that there would be something unjustified if you impose these values on us, right? There's an independent weight to the idea that coercion or imposing something, even if for the cause of a value, is kind of wrong. I mean, and that's again a second liberal conviction, right? That things can be very good, but that's not enough reason for, in some senses, for them to be coercively imposed. Now, the challenge, I think, for the pluralism view is that if the logic of that argument is extended to individuals all the way down, right, then you end up with roughly a kind of similar situation that you do to the kind of constitution of social groups, right? Which is any single individual within a particularly constituted community can also have recourse to that same argument, right? So again, you have to end up being upfront and saying, we are prioritizing freedom and non-coercion over actually the realization of that.
So I have three hands, Professor Kamala, Shruti, and Moise, in that order, and then we'll go to the next round.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I'll be quick with my question. As I was listening to you, the tension between two versions of constitutionalism in India, the negative injunction and the need for positive affirmation. And I thought I felt that you had some doubts about whether the save the Constitution ignored the second. I also was thinking, as you were recounting historically, that in many ways we circle back to an initial criticism of constitutionalism, which you find reflected, say, in Europe with the return of the social, which is now center stage. And the question of solidarity as a counterpoint to pluralism itself. So I'd really like to know why, if you wouldn't mind, Pratap, my asking you this question, why you left out terms like solidarity and social justice in your broader understanding of that, which is still marking time in Indian constitutionalism and whose time has yet not come.
Yeah, let's connect. Yeah, faster. Yeah, please.
With lots to think about, and also thank you for giving us a new language to think about. So the question I had,
Closer to you.
I had a very quick empirical question, which was, I can see the point behind it, which is when you describe the three kinds of ways of doing constitutionalism, I wasn't sure whether you were also indicating that the Indian Constitution, as it has appeared in 1950, never mind what has happened to it 70 years down the road, was an amalgamation, a hybridization of the three. The last one, obviously, was the kind of prevalent, dominant, at least spoken version of it, the kind of people attributed that is what they believed in. But I'm wondering, and that's kind of what I'm outing a little bit of my talk, that actually hidden inside, if I can use the tuck metaphor, there's a sleeping model of the party state in India's constitutional design. So that's really the question.
Moise, please.
Let me correct your address. Just a quick comment first on the connection. I mean, I too believe in this etymology. I do this myself, Samvidhan, and it's very interesting to me that it's very exactly the equivalent of constitution. So statuare is to erect, to found, to establish, and con is doing it together. And it's nice that, interesting to me that in all the saving of the constitution and so on, it's Samvidhan that gets picked up and not the other Indic expressions like Ain or Daftur and so on. And maybe we have to credit a bit of Sham Benegal for that. So with now the question, a couple of questions, one of which is, liberal constitutional democracy, in a way, the end of history rhetoric framework kind of collapses or fuses together a tension, which is, for me, imbricated in modernity itself. And that tension is a tension between constitutionalism and sovereignty. So constitutionalism, in a way, is about power, but it's also about limited and restrained power. And on the other hand, sovereignty is about absolute, illimitable exercise of power. So, where do you think India really stands vis-a-vis this tension between constitutionalism and sovereignty? And second question, in a way, resonates with Professor Shankaran. Isn't there a tension between the material constitution and pluralism? So material constitution in Ferdinand Lassalle's kind of way is, you would say that, okay, if you have a fig tree which is producing figs, and if you affix a board to it with a letter and write it and say that, okay, we will start calling this an apple tree. And just because of that, it doesn't start producing apples, right? So the material constitution is about the material contradictions in a society, and pluralism, in a way, tries to depoliticize these material contradictions in a kind of language of cultural diversity. So like the sub-classification example, for example, like the issue of caste hierarchy is in a way being now depoliticized, get rid of politics of solidarity and rework it into a language of cultural heterogeneity, which the establishment is very happy to accommodate. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful question. So, and in a kind of curious way, they're connected. So very briefly on the social justice question, because that's the big one. I mean, there's a lot to say. I think the way I would think about it is not that liberal constitutionalism, in a sense, depoliticizes the question of social justice. In fact, I'd actually argue the opposite. That by saying that the social question should not be constitutionalized, other than in this kind of negative way, right, that people are right, it actually creates the conditions for the politicization of the question of social justice. And I think one of the questions we have to ask, right, which is in a sense, I think one of the challenges of Indian constitutionalism, is it's a constitutionalism that is being asked to bear the burdens of materially constituting lots of things which constitutions by their very nature cannot, right? We've actually constitutionalized everything in some ways, right? Cultural diversity constitutionalized, somehow even material contradictions have to show up sort of in some senses in constitutional discourse. Whereas I think this is part of Ambedkar's answer as well. I mean, even though he saw that kind of contradiction very clearly, that the question of social justice is not easy to constitutionalize. It's not clear what it means to constitutionalize it, right? And if it's a genuine solidarity, in a sense, it's a solidarity that has emerged through the work of political agency and the practices of public justification, right? So we disagree over what social justice is. We disagree about the nature of the economy. We disagree about the character of the material practices that will actually produce genuine empowerment. And constitutionalizing them is precisely the way of actually depoliticizing them in some ways, right? So in a way, it's actually not hiding behind a kind of assumed solidarity that constitutionalism would conjure up in some ways. And that's why the second part of that liberal constitutionalism bit is also as important. It's not the entrenchment of rights, allocation of power, the exercise of political agency and the practices of public justification. That in a sense, those are the forms of engagement through which, right, conceptions of social justice will emerge. Now, we can actually debate about what are the conditions that secure the exercise of, in some sense, of that political agency, right? So that's when you're thinking about it, that it's not that it kind of does away, but I think it rightly, just as the Constitution does not want to burden us with a kind of identity, with, this is bearing civilizational identity, history, it's exactly for that same reason. Because it actually allows a genuine politics to, in some senses, emerge. And I think one of the mistakes that happened in global constitutionalism, which we are doing, right, there was this period, 30-year period, right? Warren Court onwards, Indian constitutionalism, American constitutionalism. I mean, somehow through constitutionalizing discourse and getting judges, you can get everything on the table, right? Every social right, every economic right. I've always been skeptical of that, but I also think even in political terms, actually, in a sense, it was a mistake in most cases. I mean, other than the sort of, I think that the discrimination right. The question about the party state you asked is really interesting. So let me kind of broaden that question out a bit, because I think the one issue that modern constitutionalism, again, very famously, has not had a clear view of is actually political parties, right? So we know liberal democracies operate through political parties, and political parties are, in some senses, wonderful things because they are ways in which you create coalitions to form workable majorities. And in that sense, they actually make politics possible. Right? Yeah. The challenge with the political party story, I think, is so there's a formal arrangement of checks and balances, right? Judiciary, executive, legislature, in most cases, executive and legislature and parliamentary government has got fused. But one of the challenges of constitutionalism is that it is in deep tension with party democracy. Because if that partisanship story is taken all the way down, it actually undercuts the autonomy of those checks and balances, which is what we are seeing in democracies globally, right? Judiciary left or right. Technically, it's not even a question you should be able to, in a sense, it's able to pose, right? So the party government story acts as a check and balance only under conditions where somehow the politics is miraculously producing enough of a balance of party power for them to actually check each other. The minute that balance shifts a little bit more to one side or the other, right? A dominant majority, enduringly crafted, right? Actually, these checks and balances will have no answer to the party state conundrum, right? So you're exactly right. I mean, it's one of the remarkable discoveries is how feeble the paper constitutionalism has been against partisanship, which is in a sense a consequence of the party. And the party state, in the sense in which you've written about it, is in a sense the extreme version of that, where one party happens to acquire that dominance. And if it also happens to be a party with a very clear ideological agenda of what it wants to do, your basic checks and balances are gone. So the checks and balances of constitutionalism, this political scientists' constant quarrel with lawyers and juristocrats. Judiciaries will be independent. They will reflect the underlying distribution of political power in society. Historically, that's how they've been. There are very few exceptions in any constitutional jurisdiction to this. The Warren Court and the post-PI and emergency court, they are not only are the exceptions, but they were also very, very, very limited exceptions we could get, right? Right. So in that sense, actually party government per se carries that risk of undermining that kind of, and that raises this pluralism question, right? So, which is why historically, right, that old joke that actually parties have to be this kind of, narrow compact, play within certain rules, treat each other as friends. Really, there have to be limits to partisanship, but in a sense, constitutionalism to survive. Moise, your wonderful question about social representation, cultural heterogeneity. So, I have, I think, a different take on, what's going on in the subclassification, story. I don't think, so I agree with you, which is that a lot of the emphasis on representing, not against representation, but see how the politics of it. A lot of the emphasis on representing, in a sense, some sense of pre-constituted social groups, right? It has been a kind of cheap and easy way of addressing the question of social power, because it does actually very little to address the material conditions that actually produce and reproduce those social power. I mean, I'll give you the crudest example. I've tried this with so many politicians. Why is it, and I'm not saying one is the substitute for the other, but why has it been so difficult for any chief minister of any state, any prime minister across political parties, to say tomorrow I'm going to actually commit to 6 to 8% of expenditure on GDP on education? Absolutely not a single one. The reverse consensus has also been massive because we were getting social justice on the cheap, right? So I actually, in a sense, agree with you that, in a way, right? That but here's the paradox, right? Precisely because it got constitutionalized, there's actually a much greater prestige and much greater political identification with this mode of incorporation than actually thinking about the material conditions that actually produce that social power in the, in some sense, in the first place. The second thing I think about this in a sense story, and I think it's reflected in the subclassification judgment, is that bizarre slippage that we all now make. This is really, in the reservation debate, in a sense, every justification has been thrown in, right? This is anti-poverty, this is representation, this is empowerment. Whereas at least the logic of Dalit reservation was clear. It was everything in a different way, right? It's anti-discrimination, and that's why the homogeneity of that class mattered. The homogeneity does not matter because this is not a device for Dalit reservation, at least, for actual economic empowerment or uplift, right? But the expansion of reservation meant that kind of the mirror theory, in some sense, and that this is a substitute for economic empowerment, has become, in a sense, the default constitutional representation of what that, in a sense, what that story looks like. And the Supreme Court is now just taking the inevitable next step in some ways, which I think it's the downside of constitutionalizing that question of social justice, which should have been properly a matter of politics in the truest sense of the term.
I have 3 questions, second round. We're already at 10:20, so we'll have to keep those questions very short. Sanjay?
Good morning, Pratap. Wonderful learning. I have a very simple question. Can we not argue that there is a temporality in atemporality? Number one. And number two, when you say that basic structure is atemporal, I would like to learn more because there are examples when court has mediated with history while doing basic structure. I remember R.C. Paudial. And therefore, can you please articulate on atemporality? And can we really say that Indian Constitution is end of history project? And my last question is, can we really say that Indian Constitution is a liberal constitution, or is it a mixed of socialist and republican constitutionalism? Thank you.
Rohit?
So my question is actually follows up very much from Professor Sanjay Jain's question, which is, you began with asking us to think about the Save the Constitution movement, and that it signals some kind of consensus or unease with changing it. But I think, it takes a lot of work to produce that moment for people have to get around and be worried about changing the Constitution. In fact, the naturalization of this discourse requires a lot of work, not just by sort of party leaders, but also other kinds of groups. And I was sort of thinking about the anecdote of Raghuveera and the choice of the word Samvidhan. One of the big debates was how do we translate the Constitution and what terms we take. And actually, a lot of the Hindi and Sanskrit words were struggling to get purchased. So there is an effort that is made to sort of pick the word, pick analogies, sort of naturalize it to Indian conditions. And I worry sometimes that the end of history analogy sort of makes that work of sustaining advantage for both good and bad.
Yes. Last question for this session.
Yeah. Professor, thank you for the lecture. Professor, I wanted to ask you 2 questions. One, in the Gita, Krishna says that I'm creating the subject, the citizens in India are pledging to the constitution. So how do we see the contradiction between the creation of two subjects, one in the Gita and also in the constitution? How does the human being, or let's say the citizen, grapple between these two dilemmas? Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. So I think Sanjay and Rohit's question are connected in some ways. So you're right, Sanjay. I mean, the reference to temporality and atemporality was too quick, and it needs elaboration. I'll say two things. I think one of which probably pertains to what Rohit, your question as well, which is, so I actually agree with you, right? There's in a sense two readings of the end of history story. One is the kind of fatalistic one. This is triumph. What else is there to do? Just go enjoy life, eat McDonald's, whatever. I mean that and there is that genuine fear, right? In some senses that if you actually take this as settled, right? That's in a sense the withdrawal of almost all kind of political life. There's a second interpretation in some ways, right? Which is that actually the only political challenge we will have, or the primary one, is this oscillation between the fatalist reading of the end of history and the we need to maintain as end of history reading, right? And in some ways, I mean, one way of thinking about the kind of the critique of the last 20 years is that we've actually gone from that, okay, the constitutional stuff is, I mean, think of kind of, when I moved back to India 2000s, years ago, you kind of took the basic constitutional framework for granted. Now the question is how you can, make life materially better, all those kinds of things. It's in a sense the return of the second version. But the thesis was that is actually the biggest challenge. This kind of oscillation between a certain kind of NUI that will creep in about this thing called liberal constitutionalism from all sides. It's too boring. It's like we've even forgotten why we got into the first place, right? It can take lots of forms. I mean, fascination with the kind of aesthetic critique. We just need some excitement in life. Anybody who can, right? Or a withdrawal, a kind of apolitical withdrawal in some ways. So, and that was exactly the danger in that story. But the interesting thing is whether our political discourse can actually transcend exactly that being the horn of the dilemma. That the moment we are in it is okay, let's somehow get over that NUI and at least save this thing, right? Rather than think of something in a sense outside of its horizon. And then that's the sense in which I'm thinking of atemporality, right? Which is, so you're right, of course, that the Supreme Court has, modified the basic structure. My own view is that it's never been clear about what it is. It's an amalgam of values and institutions. It's like the Supreme Court's reading of many, many words and articles. It could be ultimately what they choose to put in it. But insofar as there is a kind of normative core, as Sudhir has kind of articulated very powerfully, that normative core does, in some senses, seek to exercise this sort of atemporal authority, that there is a set of values and possibly a institutional configuration that exemplifies those values, not always very clearly articulated, right? That we cannot think of any form of political change that lies outside, in sense of the horizons of that amalgam in some ways. And in that sense, I mean, as it's not a theorized notion of atemporality. In that sense, it is kind of atemporal. We are kind of condemned to writing footnotes in a sense to that constitution. But I know this is subject for a longer discussion. Yeah. So there's one kind of answer to that, right, in this framework, which is, it's not a question we need to decide, right? In many of these matters, particularly in matters of metaphysics and religion, constitutions rightly said these are not the places and instruments that can decide this question. not just that, it's actually a stronger claim. It's not just that we can't decide it, right? It's that the intrinsic meaning of these things is vitiated if it is actually aligned to state or political power, right? So let the philosophers, theologians, whoever wants to debate, discuss what the meaning of the creation in Gita is, how they want to internalize it in their lives, and so on and so forth. But it's association with coercive power, right, of the state, even if you get the answer right, let's say hypothetically, right, even if you get an agreement, actually, in a sense, vitiates its internal meaning. The same thing the Constitution, I think, in the end wanted to do with identity. It's not that the identities don't matter to people. That's never been said liberally, right? It's that identities are best articulated in a context where you can actually make their articulation independent of structures of coercion, right? So at one level, you don't have to kind of say, now there's a larger kind of philosophical debate in some senses. I mean, and it depends on the level of abstraction at which you, in a sense, want to go. Because if you're just looking at the metaphysics of it, in a sense, the fact of the kind of the constitution of it, the samvidhanam in some senses of it, you could say, look, in the metaphysics of action, there's a kind of commonality. Although the ethical contexts are so different of what, in a sense, they are trying to achieve, and Krishna is kind of metaphysical in some ways, that they're actually, they're parallel streams that are not going to be able to talk to each other.
Okay, we're at 10:30 sharp. Let me say a couple of things in closing and indicate where we go from here. When we invited Pratap to do this keynote, we had in mind that his work, bringing together legal scholarship that has, for a long part of its history in India, focused narrowly on doctrinal questions and has avoided working out what the theoretical and philosophical implications of those doctrinal positions might be. And I think it's fair for me to say, and I'm not going to justify this claim, that Pratap has helped move the needle on that significantly, both through his own work, but as much through his encouragement and partnership with other scholars who have attempted to do this work. So this was one motivation, and the PACT project has a similar orientation. So we think it's apposite that he's here with us. But also that we knew that at the start of a day and a half workshop, we might start with big questions, and big questions we have. And Pratap has raised hard questions, not ones that just run along a happy popular vein of how we might think about constitutional questions and constitutional issues of our time. So we have both on the table, and to that extent, we are very well served. We get the opportunity to thank Pratap again. May I just invite everyone in the room to join your hands and say thank you. And I think we have 10 minutes for tea. No one has come and told me anything about what I'm doing to the schedule, but I'll just say we have 10 minutes for tea and 10:40 for session 1. Thank you.
It's not that that's so bad. It is.